I'm going to introduce, and I think those of you who've been on our meetings previously, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce Juston Cooper again. Now, Juston is the Deputy Director of the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, but those of you who've been here know that Juston's been working with us and he's helping us with some DEI work, and he is also going to be our facilitator for the next portion of our meeting today. So and I think this will be very engaging. So we'll have questions, but if you can hold them till the end. Juston, I'm going to put the bios of people up on for everybody to see in a moment, but let me go ahead and have you take the stage now.
Super sweet. Well, good morning to everyone. And as always, it is a pleasure to be with you and be a part of the wonderful work that the INC is engaging in. And as Loretta highlighted, my name is Juston Cooper. My daytime job, I am the Deputy Director for the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, for those of you on the call that I have not met. And I have the distinct honor and privilege of coming to the INC through Loretta and Emmett Hobley, as supporting you guys in your DEI journey, diversity, equity, inclusion, and the work of the INC. I'm a native here from Colorado, born and raised. And so these particular types of initiatives and efforts and the work that you guys are doing are near and dear to my heart as a Colorado citizen and as a native. This morning, we have a really, really exciting opportunity to hear from experts on what we'll be discussing around the Colorado legal system and the court process. Right. So this particular section is my understanding that previously that you all had presentations around policing in Colorado, and it's kind of like a phase of learning more about the criminal legal system here in Colorado and the impact and the outcomes of that system. If any of you are asking, well, why are we engaging and embarking on this journey? Well, part of it is because overall, I think that the INC, as we wrestle with, just like the country is, right, what it means to be diverse, equity, and inclusive, is really understanding the context and the impact of why that matters in the current climate that we're in. And one of the pillars of diversity, equity, and inclusion that has, to me, what I perceive to be a domino effect is the criminal legal system. The criminal legal system has been designated, right, throughout the inception of this country, but more so, especially over the last 50 plus years, half a century, as really the predominant go-to for public safety in our state and across the nation. And many of you have seen, right, over the last couple of years, some of the turmoil that the country is facing with public safety, our criminal legal system, the role, responsibility, and power of that system, and how do we look to have a system that works well for everyone. And so I commend the INC for going on this journey, really looking at the criminal legal system as it relates to the work of the INC and what you guys do and the current climate that we're in. So I just wanted to preference what this particular section of the agenda is going to be about. And I'm excited to serve today in the role as moderator and facilitator of this conversation. So I just wanted to give you guys some context of what we're about to do next. With that being said, Loretta, I do have one technical issue that we have going on. We're waiting on one of the panelists to join. So I want to check in with you and the board to see, if we could yield maybe a few more minutes. I just got off the phone with him. He's trying to connect before I go into the introduction of the panelists and kind of tee up this discussion. Oh, you're on mute, Loretta.
Yes, I muted myself. No, that's fine. That's fine. And maybe we can talk a little bit about, and I don't know if you were gonna, I didn't see the question. So, but if we have questions of maybe things that are going on,
absolutely.
I personally worked for the courts for more than 20 years, so I have way more experience with Colorado legal system than I'd like to admit, right? But I worked predominantly in the criminal issues when I first began, and I also was I was a public defender in Minnesota, and I did some other work in Minnesota, but I also worked in the Indian child welfare legal system, Indian child welfare in Minnesota Law Center, and in Colorado I did some ICWA work. But also I've worked on issues regarding um, Child Protective Services. So there's a connection between issues with not just, and I'm just going to tie this loop, right? And Juston and I have talked about this before, is, there's cradle to grave kind of issues, right? There's a connection in children in foster care, and they have a higher rate of going into the criminal justice system. So children placed out of the home have a higher risk of homelessness, so if they're in foster care, so they have a higher rate of homelessness, of criminal, contact with the police, and then in turn higher risk of being incarcerated also. So I'm just going to make that connection because I don't know if other people will, but I have that. I've worked in that area for a long time.
Absolutely.
So, and I don't know that our speakers may speak on that, but
Yes.
there's a lot of statistical, there's a lot of statistical research that shows that connection. So just tying that in a little bit, just to say that's also an issue that we don't always talk about, and a lot of people don't know about. So
Absolutely, Loretta, and thank you for that context. I think it's important for the INC members to consider, and I'm going to piggyback off of that because the nexus here, as Loretta highlighted, is that there is an impact, right, in this discussion about what's happening with the criminal legal system, our current climate, that to me intersects with the work of the INC. For example, what you will hear today from a lot of our panelists around this conversation that's directly related to the work that you guys are doing is what is called collateral consequences of being engaged in the system. What do I mean by collateral consequences? When a person engages the court system and has a criminal proceeding, that the outcome is a conviction, that conviction then is, of course, placed on their background. Now, the impact of that conviction, as many of you may know, literally creates a barrier to access to housing, access to lending for home ownership, access to capital for developing any businesses, literally in community. So it has barriers, the experience of being in the criminal legal system. And like Loretta highlighted, this can start at a very early age, right? So it can start from the juvenile track for what you may have heard about the school to prison pipeline, any encounter with law enforcement that trajects a young person into the criminal legal system, all the way into adulthood. If there is a person that has actually been convicted of a crime, has served a sentence, and is re-entering back into community. So these are the very populations, right, that move in and out in a transient nature into communities that the rhinos, that the INC is working to develop, working to improve, working to literally figure out how the development of the Denver metro area really looks. So this is the very population of residents and citizens that interact with these communities. So I wanted to give that context and piggyback off of what Loretta was saying of the importance of this conversation for the INC. Last but not least, how it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion. The criminal legal system has a disproportionate overrepresentation of people of color. This goes back centuries, the impetus of the system, but more so again in the last half century, there's been an overwhelming increase of people of color involved in the criminal legal system. So as we think about the INC embarking on the journey of diversity, equity, inclusion, as it relates to the board, as it relates to the committees, as it relates to the work that you all are doing, and really looking at not only race equity, but gender equity, right? Role equity, right? All equity is not just directly tied to race, making it controversial or sensitive. But when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're referencing to a bigger frame of inclusivity. And that could be discriminatory towards gender, race, sex, orientation, etc. And so that's why this discussion is so important when we think about the impact that the criminal legal system has on equity and inclusion of folks when we think about the quality of life, their improvement in community, their ability to participate in the economic vitality of the Denver metro area. So I wanted to give that frame. Walking us through the next steps, this is what the discussion will look like. There is a prepared set of questions that we will ask our panelists, And after those questions are answered, we want to open it up for Q&A from the audience. Please feel free and know that it is a safe space to inquire, ask questions, etc. There are two ways that you can ask questions. One, if you use down your reactions, you'll see in the reactions that you can put like a thumbs up or a hands up. Just put that up as I'll be facilitating and moderating today's panel, and I'll work diligently to get to you or your question. The second way that you can ask a question is you can place it in the chat. I will be monitoring and perusing the chat along with Loretta and Emmett, and they will notify me as well if there's a question that's in the chat. If we do not get to your question, considering that we're relatively limited in time today, please note that we will inventory your questions for the panelists, share the panelists' contact information, and feel free to reach out if you want to learn more about their perspective as it relates to the criminal legal system, more specifically today's conversation around the court system. So I just wanted to handle some of the housekeeping things as we get ready to launch into this discussion. Is that helpful, Loretta? Kind of in the frame? Super sweet.
That's great. Thank you.
All right, so we are joined by our second panelist. Both of our panelists are here in the present moment, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And I know, Loretta, that you said that you would post their bios. For folks, some folks, it's super helpful to read bios, etc. So I am going to take the time to do that. But I am extremely, extremely excited to introduce to you all our panelists for today's conversation. Both bring an extremely invaluable perspective, lived experience, and professional experience in the field to this conversation. More importantly, both have been extremely instrumental in movements in Denver, in the metro area, in the state of Colorado, have worked across the state to help improve or change or reform the criminal legal system so that any person impacted by the system has a second chance and an opportunity. And last but not least, about both of our panelists, both have been instrumental and very influential in my career, in my life. So I'm excited to introduce to you our panelists for today. And I will start with our first panelist and by reading her bio. And then after I introduce both of them, both will give you guys a quick 2-minute introduction of themselves with an introductory question. And like I said, I will be reading questions to the panelists and also moderating the panel itself. I did put a time constraint on the answers. That way we can get through the questions so that we yield time for all of you to be able to engage our panelists today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you all our first panelist for today, Miss Jaime Cowan. Miss Jaime Cowan, Esquire, is the attorney of law office of Jaime Cowan, PC. Jaime graduated from, Colorado State University in 2001 with a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science. She then attended the University of Denver-Durham College of Law and received her Juris Doctorate in 2004. Jaime began her career as a deputy district attorney in the 17th Judicial District, Adams and Broomfield counties, where she spent 5.5 years prosecuting cases from traffic, DUIs, juvenile delinquency, and major felonies. She left the district attorney's office in 2010, where she started her own criminal defense practice. In addition to that, Ms. Cowan has been actively involved in community redevelopment with a background in real estate, in addition to social justice movements, working diligently to help reconcile not only police relationships with community, but also the relationship with community as it relates to the district attorney's office. She's been a pillar and instrumental as a technical advisor to the criminal advocacy field and really helping understand the complexity of systems as it relates to reform, dismantling, and improving. And so without further ado, that is Miss Jaime Cowan. Our next panelist that I would like to introduce is Brother Alex Landau. And I've actually had the distinct privilege of working with Mr. Landau over the course of my career, which is really exciting. But let me get to his bio next. Sorry about that, I'm having a slide. It's an interesting morning with technology, I tell you. So I apologize about that. All right, let me just pull his bio up here real quick. Sorry for the delay, folks. All right. Mr. Landau, Alex Landau, among other things, is a father, a community member, a human rights advocate, a survivor of police violence. Alex is one of the co-founders of what is called the Denver Justice Project, which is a nonprofit that has primarily focused on, but not limited to, the transformation of law enforcement practices in our communities. Alex was adopted as an infant by a white family, raised in the primary rural, poor white mountain communities, and educated predominantly in white schools. During his first year of college in 2009, Alexander survived an extreme case of brutality at the hands of Denver police officers for alleged allegations of illegal left turn. This became the catalyst for the movement and the work he is now engaged in. Alex does this work through a lens of passion, intersectionality, acknowledging the impact of intersection oppression around race, gender, age, etc. It is critical to understand how others different from others experiences an injustice. Passion is important to and authenticity and endurance in the lens in which Alex looks at the work. Alex's primary focus has been, but definitely not limited to, working to put an end to violence in our communities from the hands of law enforcement, while also working to raise awareness around different types of police misconduct and methods that address injustices throughout the entire criminal legal system, including the courts, as an advocate. In doing so, Alex often finds himself on the front line, right, with community, those directly impacted, allied organizations, and folks who are politically involved and engaged in reform. He also collaborates with multiple groups across the state doing trainings around know your rights as it relates to police, know your rights as it relates to the role and power of district attorney, and also the intersectionality with the courts. Alex has built multiple networks, not just in the state, not just nationally, but also internationally in drug policy reform, harm reduction, and continues to educate and present experience and personal narratives for folks who have lived the experience of being in the criminal legal system. Alex also recognizes the difference of trauma over the years and the narrative that it shapes as people's lives when they return back to community from being engaged in the criminal legal system. And Alex and myself have done work over the last couple of years, and this brother is extremely phenomenal and has worked across the spectrum, not only in in the criminal justice reform, but also in the economic development and vitality of communities. And so that is our panel for today. Ms. Jaime Cowan, Esquire, and Mr. Alex Landau. And I want to welcome the both of you and thank you so much for participating in today's topic around the core processes for the INC, the Interneighborhood Cooperation. Folks who are folks who are listening in today, just note that both panelists have been prepped on the background of the INC and are fully aware of the wonderful and amazing work that you guys are attempting to do. So with that being said, we're going to start our opening remarks with Ms. Jaime Cowan, Esquire. And the opening question that I want the panel to hear that both panelists will answer upon introducing themselves, because I probably did not do the best job of that, please note that you will hear the question as well. And I think Ms. Loretta just raised her hand, so I just want to check in before I move forward. Good to go? All right, super sweet. So our first opening statement question is to Ms. Cowan, who will introduce herself as well and answer the question. And the question reads as such: often, the average person, even if they have not been in the court system, does not understand how the court system in Colorado is structured or works. If you had the opportunity to explain why it's important to know the court system, what would you say and why? I will now hand it over to Ms. Cowan.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that great introduction, Justin. Again, my name is Jaime Cowan. I'm kind of a native because I've been here since I was 5. My grandmother came to Colorado one time and said, we're going to move to Denver from Illinois, and it was probably the best decision for us that she could have made. That question goes back to what people do not understand of the levels of courts. And so I was thinking about this question because it comes up often. Why? So let me give a background of how our courts are structured. We have municipal courts. So for instance, Aurora has its own court. The city of Thornton has its own court. That's a lower level of court. That is where there's usually speeding tickets, petty thefts, things like that. The next level of court is the state court system. So that's bigger charges. And while you have traffic charges there, most often that's where your DUIs go. And then your felony cases, which could go to district court. And then we get to federal system, which we're not talking about. The one thing that people don't understand is that all of this starts with police officer discretion. The police officers determine when they make contact with somebody in their discretion where somebody is going to go. And what people don't understand is that has a longer effect. If you are going to city court, 9 times out of 10, those charges do not show on a criminal record, number one. Number two, those charges are easier to come off of a criminal record. When you get into state court, be that county court where DUIs and misdemeanors are, or district court where felonies are, your track record of your history is substantial and it's going to stay there for a longer period of time. So I try to educate people when they, hopefully before they come and see me, but when they do have to come and see me, about why that is. The officer has that power in that first transaction to determine how long standing something is going to affect a person. The second thing is when we talk about juveniles specifically, they start this school to prison pipeline in the municipal court. And then they track them all the way to what we call the delinquency court. And those municipal violations hurt them later. And a lot of people don't understand that an officer gets to really decide the direction of your future when they make that first contact with you. So I think it's important for people to know that, and I try my best to educate them on your contact with any police officer could have long-standing impact on your life because they have the power from the very beginning of your journey into the criminal justice system. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cowan. Sincerely appreciate that. Very interesting nuance in thinking about the different levels of how Colorado's court system, you guys, is structured from municipal to county to district, right? And the different levels of who's involved at those courts in different times and the different impacts that they have. So thank you so much, Ms. Cowan, for answering that initial question. I left out one logistical thing for our audience today is you'll see in my particular box, I will be taking time as well, right? So please note panelists that you'll see in my box that you'll see when you have 2 minutes, 30 seconds, or 1 minute left, or 30 seconds to keep us on time. So now I'll punt the same question to Mr. Landau. Mr. Landau, the question itself is often the average person, even if they have been in the court system, does not understand how the court system in Colorado is structured or works. If you had to explain why it's important to know, what would you say and why? Mr. Landau, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Yes, thank you to the other panelists as well. I just want to piggyback off of that for a second. I would add in reference to what law enforcement also has the control over. That is very much your first interaction with the criminal justice system. And on a street metaphorical level, your first actual face-to-face with somebody who could act as a judge. There are also cases, as we've seen many, many times across the state, where officers decide to kill someone. So as we all know, they function as the judge, jury, and the executioner in this street arena of a court of law, which also I think then leads me to my next point. One thing I would tell people in the state of Colorado, which oftentimes gets conflated and confused, is civil court. So we just referenced a whole lot of language about criminal court, but what happens after, say, an individual is assaulted by a police officer or a case of misconduct occurs, what often happens in criminal court is you will be charged with a criminal offense, oftentimes for officers to cover up the amount of actions, abuse, whatever they decided to do as an excuse for their actions. And what we see is oftentimes trumped up criminal charges that, if not dismissed, will prevent someone, a victim of police violence, from being eligible for even hearing a lawsuit in civil court. So civil court is where most of the time where officers end up assaulting someone or hurting someone, you as a victim or as a survivor end up going into an entirely different arena once your criminal charges are either you're either found not guilty, you're convicted, or you're dismissed. And then so after that proceeding, then you will go into a criminal or a civil arena where you have the ability to fight for monetary repercussions. You can make amendments to laws, policies, procedures, etc. But oftentimes people think in the criminal proceedings or in the civil proceedings that police officers can be disciplined the same way most other people who go through the criminal proceedings are. And that's where it gets conflated. Civil cases, criminal cases, and discipline of police are not synonymous at all. The only thing that they have in common is the incident of brutality or misconduct that takes place. And then all three of these other arenas pin off of this one particular incident. So for an officer going through civil proceedings will only take place if a community member successfully goes through the criminal process first. So if individuals in the community find themselves victimized by law enforcement and you come into contact with the criminal justice system, one thing to keep in mind is how you navigate that arena on the street will then play a role how you navigate your interaction in the arena in the criminal court, which if you take a plea here or something goes against your favor, could certainly impact whether you'd even be eligible to reach civil court or have a case in civil court. So finding distinguishment between those three things, I think, is one thing I would leave folks in Colorado with.
Super important, Mr. Landau. Thank you for that answer. And folks, what you heard is, again, the first interaction with the court system comes through law enforcement. And we're seeing the climate right now in the country over the last 5+ years around what's happening with policing and communities of color, like Mr. Landau highlighted, right? That's really elevated nationally and brought to the community's attention, literally the criminal legal system and how the cops interact with courts. And you heard from Mr. Landau, really not only just the criminal proceedings and engagement in the courts, but also the civil proceedings and the lack of indictment of officers, but folks who have been victimized at the hands of officers not only go through a criminal proceeding where they themselves could become the actual be accused, but then once that's settled, then there's a civil side of our court system in Colorado that interacts literally with the criminal court system as well. And one of the demonstrations of that is when you have a person who has been victimized by police and also has been engaged in the criminal legal system with a background, and how that plays out in both of our court systems. And so I want to thank you both for answering that opening question, Ms. Cowan and Mr. Landau. Extremely important on, if I was telling you all what our court system is and how we interacted with it, what would I say to the average person? Those two answers say, initially you become into the court system through policing. You go through a criminal proceeding that could be at multiple layers, from municipal to county to district. And then if you are a victim of the system, there's a civil side that interacts with our Colorado court system. Our next question, and I'm going to switch the order. Each panelist will have 3 minutes to answer this question. Our second question, ladies and gentlemen, to the panelists. Criminal proceedings in court include the following actors: judges, district attorneys, and defense counsel. In your opinion, what is the role and power of each? And are there other actors that are important for people on this call to know about who influence the outcome of a criminal case? Mr. Landau, we're going to start with you on that question. Please let me know if you would like for me to repeat the question, but you will have 3 minutes to answer question 2. We'll start with
Perfect.
Mr. Landau.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. No, I understand it. So, yeah, in the way that I see it, especially coming from the lens of a survivor, a Black man, and a human rights advocate, the defense attorney is there oftentimes to preserve the integrity of the individual who is in front of the judge and being charged by the district attorney. This is your entity that's going to fight for you, even if you're guilty, essentially. Oftentimes, especially in cases of law enforcement violence, the individual who's being represented by defense counsel usually hasn't done something wrong, but there are exacerbated charges attached to justify the action. The judge is supposed to sit there as a neutral party who takes both sides of the argument from prosecution and defense, and then comes up with a balanced verdict based on the ability of both sides to argue their side. And the prosecution, in my eyes, the district attorney is the most influential player in the entire criminal justice system. They are the most powerful entity. They decide who gets charged with felonies. They decide who gets charged with misdemeanors. They decide who gets charged at all. And I also believe that they perpetuate law enforcement violent culture by neglecting to indict officers who engage in these types of behaviors. The only other entity that I can immediately think of that I think is important to know is the jury. The jury, oftentimes, especially in high profile cases, allegedly is a jury of your peers, but as we've seen many times, these are peers who are pooled from miles away from where the incident took place. And oftentimes we see district attorneys, defense, or judges really they're very stringent on who they allow on the process to ensure a fair trial. Sometimes that works in the favor of the person who's under defense counsel. Sometimes that works in opposition. But I do think that juries are some of the most important people when we actually make it to a trial in a court of law.
Mr. Landau, thank you. You still have a minute remaining. Do you want to yield that minute, or is there additional? If you can, actually, I'm just going to actually redirect. Can you talk a little bit more about the role and power of the district attorney? I know that it's important work that you've done over the last couple of years. What would you like this audience to know about that work, of the role and power of a district attorney? With 1 minute left.
Certainly. So I think district attorneys, being the most influential players, oftentimes, especially in marginalized communities and community members who we find in front of the judge being prosecuted by a district attorney, you got to understand that over 90% of cases never make it to trial. And this is usually because of excessive charging on behalf of the district attorney, usually felonious, that then in a court of law gets pled down to either a lower felony charge or a high level misdemeanor to secure a conviction, because what people are really honestly doing is gambling with their life in front of the criminal justice system that's been structured against them historically. And this is a gamble that most people really aren't willing to take. So I would honestly encourage everybody who's listening, if you've been summoned to for jury duty, some of the best things you can do for your community member, especially if you're looking at how to activate and get involved in this type of work, could be just to sit on a jury and learn the criminal justice system from the inside, like a volunteer should, and make a informed decision that could really change the outcome of somebody's life.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Landau. I thought that was important. You know, folks, what we're discussing, we're asking our panelists as we think about and educate you on the role of the court system in the state of Colorado, is who are the actors? You've heard the different structures. You've heard the interaction with law enforcement and the court system. But what you're hearing now is, who are the actors in the court system? What are their impact? And next we'll go to our panelist, Ms. Cowan, where we'll ask her the same question. She'll have 3 minutes, and I'll repeat the question for the audience. Question number 2, criminal proceedings in courts include the following actors: judges, district attorneys, and defense counsel. What is, in your opinion, the role and responsibility and power of each? And are there other actors that are important for people on this call to know about, who influence the outcome of a criminal case? Ms. Cowan, I'll point the question to you. You will have 3 minutes.
To piggyback off of what Mr. Landau said, just so that we are clear, no one has more power than the district attorney in the criminal justice system, for the reasons that Mr. Landau outlined. They're the ones that bring the charges. They're the ones that dismiss the charges. They're the ones that bring the plea bargain offers, and they're the ones that make the sentencing recommendations. What we often find, and what people forget, and maybe we need to redo civics in high school, is our system of checks and balances. When I was a district attorney, I was very clear with law enforcement that we were not on the same side. My job was to make sure that they did their job appropriately. I will tell you, I was the anomaly, which is why they only got 5.5 years. One thing that we are not talking about is the role of politics that gets played in the criminal justice system. This starts from the election cycle. This also starts from the fact that a lot of the electorate passes over that section of the ballot when the DA's race is coming, because of course the district attorney's race runs with the presidential race. And what people forget is the district attorney is the president of your county. And they are the ones that are setting the tone for what justice, and I put that in quotes, because really it's a system of accountability, what that system really looks like. And so what I urge everyone to do, we're now in our 4-year cycle, but in the next 4 years, really figure out who your DA is and really figure out, do their values align with yours? I have had several cases that I have had district attorneys say to me, I would like to do something different, but I can't because the elected told me X, Y, and Z. Or I had a case in Arapahoe County where it was leaving the scene of an accident that was caused by the victim, but the victim was the son of a police officer. There were no offers in this case for that specific reason. And so when we have this closeness, and I would love to say that judges are impartial, but what we've seen currently in the news with Ms. Chase from Arapahoe County is that also isn't that true. And so it is important because judges are appointed, district attorneys are elected. That's where we as the people really have our voices heard, is in that election cycle. And also let me urge everyone as the trial lawyer on this call, please do not duck jury service. Please show up for your jury service. And that is the one way that we can ensure some level of fairness. Because if not, then it's basically the cop is the judge, jury, and executioner, or the district attorney is the judge, executioner, and the jury. So please, all of you, go on your summonses and show up for court. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cowan. And I'm going to piggyback to the audience off of both panelists' comments. You heard a lot about the actors, right? The judges' roles as impartiality, the DA's roles as the most powerful actor, the defense counsel who holds the integrity. But I find it really interesting for the audience to really understand what Ms. Cowan highlighted, is that is the political optics. It's really important when you think about the court system and who's involved, who the actors are, that to know judges are appointed and they become up for retention during elections. District attorneys are elected. In Colorado, ladies and gentlemen, we have 22 judicial districts. Our court system, as Ms. Cowan highlighted, Civics 101 in high school, we have 3 branches of government. Our court system is our judicial branch of government, right? And in Colorado, we have 22 judicial districts. All 22 judicial districts elect their own district attorney. And so it's important in understanding that structure, but to the point, like both panelists highlighted, the roles, responsibility, and power, and politically statutes, our constitution, that actually dictates and drives their role, responsibility, and power. And then, like Ms. Cowan highlighted, how that plays out in actual cases. And the importance of others who play a major role is the jury. And you were encouraged, please don't dodge that jury duty, right? As it comes up, because your role and responsibility as a tax-paying citizen to civically engage is through that opportunity, especially when it comes to the court system. All right, how are we doing on time, Loretta? We have a couple of more questions and then I want to open it up to the audience. Are we doing okay?
We're good with time.
Super sweet, just wanted to check in. And if Loretta or Emmett, if y'all can, I have not had a chance to look at the chat, but as folks are conjuring questions, listening to the panelists now, please put that in the chat and we're going to get to that. Our third question, we're going to reverse order. This question, each panelist will have 2 minutes to answer, and we will start with Ms. Cowan. Question number 3. Based upon your experience, what would you say are some of the major gaps, issues, and concerns facing Colorado's court system? Ms. Cowan, you will have 2 minutes.
Well, I think one of the major gaps is the focus on retribution or punishment as opposed to a focus on treatment. Now we are seeing some sweeping reform changes happening where we have a drug court or a veterans court or a mental health court. The problem is they're not consistent. It's left to each specific county. But the focus, I think, needs to shift away from always a 911 call to the police officers. So for instance, somebody might be having a mental health crisis, but you call 911, and now we've started a 911 call to the police, which then likely leads to charges and not a transport to the mental health hospital. And this is a huge problem. We are also talking about addiction in a whole different way, moving forward from choice theory, which is they chose to do it, that's why they're here. Now we are focusing more on the brain science behind addiction, which then has led to a lot of drug charges being reduced to felonies and a lot more options for treatment as opposed to conviction, probation, or prison. That gap needs to be filled. As Mr. Landau mentioned, 90% of cases resolve in plea bargain. And what that suggests to us is, and I can tell you from 16 years in practice, certain counties are overcharging to just get the conviction later. But we're not focusing on the whole person once they're released. Not all allegations of crimes, I think, put us into the court system. But now we're starting to look at the why. I think we could go further into looking at the why. Also, the gap is a lack of transparency. No one really knows how these decisions get made. No one really knows what goes on. And I think if more offices, police departments, court systems, district attorneys' offices were more transparent, A, there wouldn't be a view of so much discrimination, but B, people would understand. So 2 things I want you to take away from this gap. Number 1 being there needs to be a more reform focus to keep people out of prison. And number 2, these offices need to be more transparent in their decision making with the community, because then we get this appearance of impropriety all the time. And there's this distrust all the time. Thank you.
Ms. Cowan. Very interesting, ladies and gentlemen, when we think about, are there gaps, issues, and concerns facing Colorado's court system? And what you heard is historically and traditionally, our court system has had the ideology of punishment, impunity. It sounds like Ms. Cowan is saying one of the gaps is that, A, we need to re-examine that ideology or philosophy of less punishment and more rehabilitation, which is the impetus of how the criminal legal system was designed. Secondly, the transparency. Part of why we had this panel today is to help educate you guys on the structure of the court system, not assuming that you don't know, but more important, the nuances. And one of those nuances is the lack of transparency of our tax-paying voting citizens really understanding the role and responsibility of the court system and how injustice lies. And so next, we'll have Mr. Landau answer that same question. I'll repeat the question for the audience. And Mr. Landau, you will have 2 minutes to answer question number 3. Based upon your experience, what would you say are some of the major gaps, issues, and concerns facing Colorado's court system? Mr. Landau, you have 2 minutes.
Certainly, thank you. I would say 2 things. One, I mean, JC, you've hit the nail on the head for years, man. You work for an organization who highlighted that we spend almost $1 billion in Colorado on prisons alone, not parole, not supervision of any other kind, not county jails, just prisons. And one thing that I think that's very important is to understand that a lot of this money, not only in the criminal justice system, but also in the DA's office, the district attorney's office around the state, is responsible for what we're supposed to reference as trauma-informed services, victim support for people who have been victimized by criminal behavior. And we have hundreds of millions of dollars flowing around the state of Colorado that could be better utilized for trauma-informed services, for recognizing trauma, for substance use, for pre-booking diversion programs, simply rethinking how we strategize around community health, safety, and policing, and what that can look like. There are people out there, such as myself, say a victim of law enforcement violence who hasn't necessarily seen an individual get prosecuted. The police who injured someone doesn't get charged with a crime. That means I'm not eligible for victim services out of the district attorney's office. So reclarifying what eligibility looks like anyone who goes into prison, a good majority of these people are coming home. And to spend a chunk of time, any chunk of time in the penitentiary is going to be traumatic. Our communities are over-policed, they're over-prosecuted, they are over-incarcerated, and they're over-supervised upon release. So what we need to understand is, how do we get out of, like our other panelist, Ms. Cowan, said, how do we get out of this tough on crime mentality, this penalization of people, and how do we really begin to incorporate a lens of healing, recognition, and stability into these people's lives? So I would just advise people to think, like, with all of the money that's flowing around, how can we better utilize some of these pots of money to get the outcomes that we as an entire community actually want to see?
Mr. Landau, thank you so much. You know, it's interesting perspective on when we think about the gaps, issues, and challenges, to think about how taxpayer dollars are spent on this system. In fact, to Mr. Landau's point, in 2019, a report showed that our Colorado legislator, through what is called the general fund, every year the governor, the legislator sets the budget for our state. In 2019, our court system received $800 million to operate and function, right? Nearing close to $1 billion, very similar to our Department of Corrections, our prison system. And so how I invite you guys to think about Mr. Landau's point is that these are taxpayer dollars. These are the priorities that our elected officials state as far as what Colorado's investment into the criminal legal system is. We're nearing $1 billion on prisons. We're nearing $1 billion on court systems. And when we think about where our investment goes, and we think about, to Ms. Cowan's point, that we're responsible for electing these folks into office, that means that their values have to align with our investment, like Ms. Cowan was highlighting. That is our civic engagement responsibility as tax-paying citizens. So now, there was a very interesting question in the chat, so I'm going to deviate a little bit away from the formatted questions because it's relevant. But I'm hearing from the audience, Ms. Cowan and Mr. Landau, that they would like to hear a little bit more about the role, responsibility, and power of judges, DAs, and defense. They're wanting to see if you both can expound on that some. And so I wanted to punt back, starting with Ms. Cowan, and yield a few more minutes for you to expand on that conversation, especially provided your experience as being both a district attorney and defense counsel. So you bring a real unique perspective to the question about the role and responsibility of both. And then, Mr. Landau, I want to yield you a few more minutes to ensure that this is what the audience wants to hear more about from the panel. I would love to spend a little bit more time on that. So I will start with you, Ms. Cowan. I will give you at least 2 minutes to expound on that, and then we'll punt to Mr. Landau. Ms. Cowan.
So, to say what I said,
Oh, I'm sorry. I left out one nuance.
Okay.
As it relates to youth, the juvenile system as well. That sounds like that's the question in the end. So, yes.
I seen that one come up in the chat, so I'm glad that you, and here's the problem, right? We mentioned it and we kind of talked around the school to prison pipeline. So when I did 2.5 years of juvenile prosecution, and yes, you would have some robberies or things like that, but a lot of these cases started from a fight in school. And I would think to myself, wow, when I was in school, it wouldn't have brought the police to the school. I wouldn't end up having to go to court. But that's where we're at these days. And I think that's the track record you're starting. It is, oh, I'll just call the police. Now this kid either has a municipal case or he has a juvenile delinquency case, but he now has a record. And this is how quickly, when you label people as criminals, this is how quickly these things then escalate to the next stage, because they're already engaged in this system. And that would be the problem. I don't like zero tolerance because I think it's very easy to call the police and say, hey, can you deal with this, instead of finding problem solving within the school. Although I understand that some of the schools are burdened a little bit with this, but I do believe that it is what we are what we have been talking about. It is this notion of over policing. And that is what is going on. It starts this long criminal track record for a small fight that maybe happens in the cafeteria. Go and see that kid in 2 years. This kid in 2 years, most often than not, has now had something else come up and something else come up. And there might be a series of probation revocations. So his contact with the criminal justice system becomes longer than just, hey, we could have resolved this with some school detention and you move on, but you're not coming into the criminal justice system. So that has been a problem in a lot of what we talk about. Now, there are diversion programs for juveniles, and because the juvenile justice system is not criminal but adjudicatory, there's a lot more resources in terms of trying to keep them out, and it's easier to get their records expunged. But the main problem is something so small then brings them into court, and probably a place they don't need to be.
Ms. Cowan, thank you. Thank you. And that talks about a lot of the trajectory around the school to prison pipeline, the role that police play in enabling that pipeline to happen, and how it actually plays out in court. Ms. Cowan, thank you so much for highlighting that, because I think most people don't really understand that trajectory. It can start off a very petty issue that's usually happened traditionally. Schools manage that through their disciplinary actions, right? But then it becomes criminal once law enforcement is contacted. And for most folks who may not know, but may remember vividly the very tragic incident of Columbine. Well, what a lot of the layperson in Colorado don't know is that from that incident, the legislatures who created the zero tolerance policy post-Columbine rolled out policy that placed police officers in school, called school resource officers, as a response to the Columbine issue. What we have found in the research is since that time, the trajectory of the school to prison pipeline has increased by 300% once officers were placed in schools. And so to Ms. Cowan's point, that is the impetus and the start of the school to prison pipeline as it relates to the courts. Mr. Landau, want to punt to you now and yield 2 more minutes to you on the in-depth question that the audience wants to know more about. And that is this conversation around the role and the power of the district attorneys, judges, and defense counsel as it relates to young people. What is the impact that they have? If you can expound on that a little bit more, that'll be super helpful for the audience to hear. Mr.
Certainly,
Landau?
yeah. I definitely think there's a serious level of cultural awareness that has to come into play here. I mean, like you said, you have police in schools. Of course, you're going to yield policing results when you have police policing our young people. I myself actually got into a fight when I was in 8th grade that resulted in a felonious charge that was adjudicated later, all because of the lack of diversity in my institution. A lot of these people who were teaching me at a young age had never actually been around a person of color before. I grew up in white neighborhoods. I was the only Black kid in my entire school. And small things for me became very major, very fast, that were then dealt with law enforcement more often than not. And I think that's very true for a lot of our young people. It oftentimes offers teachers kind of an out for these complicated situations, while subsequently also further burdening law enforcement who are unqualified to be in this role anyway. So I think part of the understanding that people need to also be aware of, there's this common misperception that, their young people get a clean slate when they become adults. It's not as serious when you're a child. That's actually very inaccurate. And that kind of thinking also perpetuates the reinstallation and the revolving door of the criminal justice system in people's lives. I myself found that out the hard way when I turned 18 and went and thought that I all of a sudden had a clean slate and went through the expungement process, or what we know as the sealing process. And that was very cumbersome. And I was actually denied by the judge. I wasn't able to seal it. And I had to type several letters and send them to a variety of departments. So I think one thing to understand is actually the introduction to the criminal justice system and young people is very much that encapsulation to try to get you for the rest of your life. And I really think one thing we need to understand and educate our young people on more is navigating interactions with law enforcement to better possible outcomes. teaching young people how to interact, what to say, what not to say, what to be aware of when they're driving, when they're walking, because we don't have these types of classes readily available in schools for young people. So when young people who are living adult lives at very young ages get out into the community after school, 2:30 in the afternoon, and their parents are working until 5, these are some of the most critical hours for our young people. These are when gang violence happens. These are when underage pregnancies happen, teen pregnancies. These are when law enforcement contact our young people and take advantage of their naivete. So I really think that part of the job that we can do with these young people is Endeavor Justice Project does these types of trainings. Get them in a know your rights training. Teach them how to navigate interactions with law enforcement, because as we've talked about, that is the prerequisite, the precursor to the criminal justice system. And how you handle whatever happens with a police officer, whether it's in the street or in the hallway on the way to lunch, is going to play a serious role on how this transpires in a court of law.
Thank you, Mr. Landau. And I'm going to piggyback off of your last statement, because one of the questions in the chat was around if you or Jaime do any trainings in DPS or work with DPS to train students and speak with students around these issues. And you just hit the nail on the head. That education for young people is vitally important. And it is an education that the Denver Justice Project does. I know Ms. Cowan has been a guest speaker in multiple schools, helping young people and including young adults. When we think about young people, consider young adults. In the state of Colorado, although 18 is the legal age, adolescent brain development science teaches us that actually young people are not considered fully developed in the brain until age 25. And so we have to consider the criminal legal system looks at ages 18 to ages 24 as young adults as well. And so these trainings are paramount to the chat question around if the panelists do any education and training, and both have emphasized the importance. I want to take a quick step back to one of the previous question around the court system. I think Ms. Cowan highlighted this in her answer, and this in the audience understanding the system of our court system. She mentioned veteran court, mental health court, and these different courts that you heard her say in her response. It's important for the audience to know that our court system has developed in each judicial district what is called specialty courts. These specialty courts are designed to divert a defendant to receive not special or what is considered special treatment, but more so a court that is designed in its expertise to deal with folks who are dealing with mental health, who are dealing with substance abuse issues, who are veterans returning right from war, who suffer from PTSD or any of these type of systems. These courts are designed to deal with those populations directly. They have also became part of our court system, and they're also part of the $800 million that I mentioned to you that the state has allocated to our judicial system to design these specialty courts. One limitation that I have observed with specialty courts is it's not transparent to you as a tax-paying citizen the outcome of these courts. Who is actually being served? What is the outcome for our veterans? I do believe that there are veterans right now on this call who have served our country honorably, but there are veterans who return home, who engage in the criminal legal system, not just our young adults, who are often disproportionately mistreated or discriminated upon, and they too are involved in our legal system. So these specialty courts in Colorado state court process have been designed to serve these folks, but it's important to Ms. Cowan's point around transparency of how many of you guys know the outcomes of these specialty courts that you are currently paying for. Our next question, and we'll go back to the chat as well.
Justin, could I chime in just?
Yes.
Could I chime in a second? I just want to add something on specialty courts, because I worked with the family drug treatment court for many years. And I have, a lot of firsthand knowledge working with families and individuals and adult drug courts. And we had a veterans court, et cetera. So one of the issues that I've seen in the court process is that not everybody can be a part of that, right? So there's inconsistencies and disparity in that also. So they don't allow everybody. So, and it's easy to fail, the drug court system or whatever, the veterans court, and then you go back into the regular system. The thing is that some of the some of the, the carrots and the sticks for drug court or with the specialty courts is to go to immediate jail. I mean, that can be an issue too. So that's also a problem. But I think the main thing is the equity issue of who's allowed to be in those courts and who isn't. So I just want to add that piece.
Thank you so much, Loretta. You actually teed up our next question. You're absolutely right. Ladies and gentlemen, when you think about our court system and the level of investment, to Loretta's point, in that the state makes with your money into our court system, what are the outcomes? And to Loretta's point, a lot of the specialty courts have disparate outcomes of who gets referred based upon age, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender. Who gets referred to these courts? Who has the opportunity, what these specialty courts say is promoting a second chance? And those outcomes and those disparities are very important for you all to know. I've seen in the chat, a few people said, we didn't even know that Colorado had specialty courts. Again, going back to Ms. Cowan's point of transparency and the point of this panel educating you on our court system. I'm going to piggyback off of Loretta, and our next question to both panelists, we'll start with Mr. Landau. You'll have 3 minutes for this question. Before we go there, Loretta, how are we doing on time? We only have one more question, and I really want to open it up to the audience.
We're good. We're good.
Okay, super sweet. This next question, each panelist will have 3 minutes. We're going to start with Mr. Landau, building off of our last statement around outcomes and disparities. Mr. Landau, the question is, Colorado faces an ongoing public debate regarding the equity of outcomes of people of color in the court system. What are your thoughts about the outcomes of criminal proceedings based upon race and ethnicity? And do you think the outcomes are equitable? Why or why not? So in your experience, what is the outcome based upon race and ethnicity? And do you think they're equitable? Why or why not? Mr. Landau, you will have 3 minutes to answer this question. Please start.
Thank you. No, absolutely not. I don't think it's a debate at all. I know for a fact they're not equitable. And if anybody knows a thing or two about history, you can just follow the direct lineage from the inception of the criminal justice system, or confinement, as we call it, into modern day, and everything that's been utilized as a crutch towards marginalized communities to ensure their continuous flow back into the criminal justice system. I think one thing that we have to understand is that the system's been designed to do exactly what it's doing. There's nothing broken about it. Anything that we're coming up with as an alternative way to look at public health and safety in the criminal justice system, these are new thoughts. These aren't old mechanisms that all of a sudden fell off that need to then be revisited and started up again. Our criminal justice system is doing exactly what it's been designed to do. And I think one thing we need to consider is, how do we take responsibilities away from the criminal justice system and move those into more beneficial forms of community health and treatment. One thing Denver Justice Project did, we were, amongst other organizations, one of the entities that helped launch Street Team Assisted Response in the Denver metro area. And that is a van of clinicians that rolls around to cases of behavioral health, substance use, and homelessness. Doesn't even need police. And so things like this, there wouldn't necessarily be a need for the continuous expansion and branding of new types of court if we stopped criminalizing some of these behaviors that were better off actually just considered as public health issues, community health issues, not criminal justice issues, and we treated them as such. So I think one thing we need to understand is that we're really trying to incarcerate our way out of issues that we can never incarcerate our way out of. These are issues that need to be dealt with by specialists. And the criminal justice system certainly, if anything else, creates more disparities than rehabilitation. I think for my own experience, as a Black man, my first introduction to the criminal justice system happened in middle school. And it's been a revolving door since then to the point to where I have been profiled just driving down the street and beaten almost to death by police. I have seen no inclination that the criminal justice system does anything else but offer disparities. Dealing with folks who are coming home after long stints in the criminal justice system, working with Juston Cooper and other individuals, we've seen people who have spent decades of their life who come home and are just completely traumatized and are unrecognized for their trauma. Don't know how to use cell phones, debit cards, things like that, don't have a home. So before I can even begin to assess my behavioral health stability, I need to find a place to call a house. So, I mean, there are plenty of things out here that intersect with one another that in its entirety is the complex of the criminal justice system, but they function as silos. And when these silos function as they do, it makes it far more complicated for individuals to actually get stabilized resources in the criminal justice system. We make up as Black people a larger percent of our prison population than we do in our general state population.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Landau. As we've heard, the disparities in outcomes of the criminal court process in Colorado historically have
Justin
been.
Cooper,
Yes.
can I add one other thing in there real quick?
Yes, please.
And I think you might be able to piggyback off this too. If there was equity as we claim in our criminal justice system, then we wouldn't have over 70% of people going back to prison for nonviolent technical parole violations, not commission of new crime.
Absolutely. To the point of outcomes, again, the revolving door, like Ms. Cowan even highlighted earlier, and Alex's point, is the outcomes is this continuum of folks revolving in and out of the system, right? The courts play a key role in that functionality. These outcomes are disparate amongst people of color significantly. Overrepresentation in our prison system, overrepresentation in our jail system, overrepresentation in our state supervision system, which is our parole system when folks come out of prison, our probation system that's ran by each county, right? Our pretrial system where folks are supervised until they actually complete their court proceeding. The data, which folks, I encourage you as you engage and be more interested in this topic, around how our court system processes our criminal proceedings and the outcomes, the data is out there glaringly showing the disparities amongst people of color who are involved in the system, as you've heard from our panelist, Mr. Landau, and how that starts early from our school to prison pipeline, how that starts early with engagement with law enforcement, how it's targeted, how the system is producing the very outcome, like Mr. Landau highlighted, that it is designed to do. We will now punt that question to Ms. Cowan. I will repeat the question where the audience has the opportunity to hear. Ms. Cowan, you will have 3 minutes to answer the question on this very, very intriguing topic, right, around disparities and outcomes of the court system. And the question reads as such: Colorado faces an ongoing public debate regarding the equity of outcomes of people of color in our court system. What are your thoughts about the outcomes of criminal proceedings based upon race and ethnicity? And do you think that the outcomes are equitable? Why or why not? And this is interesting considering your position as 5 years as a prosecutor and now as defense counsel, seeing both sides. A, are they equitable outcomes? Why or why not? Ms. Cowan, you will have 3 minutes.
I would just take the word equitable out. And we have to go back before you even get to the criminal justice system, right? Because the district attorney is not in the street arresting people. This also starts with the premise of our communities are already over-policed, with the thought of, well, we'll get them in the system. Now they're going to be incarcerated. Now they'll be on probation. They'll probably won't make it on probation. So then they'll be incarcerated at the end of the day. So the initial issue starts with the over-policing in Black and brown communities, and not to protect and serve, but definitely to police and incarcerate, charge and then incarcerate. As I was lucky to come into Adams County at a time that Adams County very much was a different type of county in terms of how charges were brought, who they were brought against, and really treating like people the same. And when I say that is it didn't matter what race someone was. If you were charged with the DUI and Johnny was charged with the DUI. All we're looking at is charges. Unfortunately, that is not how it is done everywhere. And that is not how it's being done today. Race and ethnicity, even gender, plays a huge role in the types of punishments and the types of charging decisions that get made. The unfortunate thing is, how do you train out someone's implicit bias? Because a lot of these things are what is expected in Black and brown communities, is that they will be criminals. And I've had certain district attorneys say that to me, that's just the expectation. And so it's really a retraining of how we look at race and ethnicity overall, not just in the criminal justice system. Because there is something that fundamentally happens, that where the color of my skin is automatically a crime. If I raise my voice, I'm automatically thought of as angry. And we have to start thinking about and talking about these conversations more globally than we do. Unfortunately, that is the wall I beat my head against in terms of being now a defense attorney. When I made up all the rules, it was very different. Now I'm beating my head against certain things. And I will tell you, I 9 times out of 10 are going to more jury trials for Black and brown clients, because I'm not being heard at this level, that this would not be something that was charged against somebody who was not Black or white. I don't know if anyone here I was on 9 News and we were talking about pretrial services, and there is a man in Denver who was charged with a murder, who has been thwarting pretrial services. Well, I have Black and brown clients that are not on pretrial services for murder. And if they miss a call or a check-in, we're back in the court for a complaint for an arrest warrant. The difference being, and I spoke to this, the race of the man who is charged with murder and his bank account allow him to get away with things that my clients would not be getting away with. And so equity, I would submit, does not even exist most times in the criminal justice system. It's already a thought that you're a criminal. Every time I see the beyond a reasonable doubt until the district attorney proves somebody guilty, it's actually unless, because we're all presumed innocent. But in Black and brown communities, we're all presumed guilty. And we have to go into these courtrooms and fight charges that either are overcharged, maybe the officers aren't doing the right thing to get into contact with me, but even my attorney, for instance, has to fight this battle for me because the district attorney or whoever is not looking beyond the paper to say, high crime area. That's another word for Black and brown. Suspicious area. That's another word for Black and brown. Oh, he was going a couple miles under the speed limit in a Cadillac in this area. That is code for pretext to stop because that person is Black or brown. And these are the issues that I, again, submit. There is no equity. It has been, I agree with Mr. Landau, it is working in the way it was designed to work.
You know, the panelists are really highlighting the complexity, you guys, of our Colorado court system, but not just the court system. I think it's often important to know that these systems work in tandem. We're talking about the tandem. We're talking about the criminal legal system. What a in-depth conversation that we're having with the panelists right now. At this point in time, I am going to pivot to questions from you all. We'll wrap up with 1 minute closing statements. That's going to be preferenced with a question for the closing statement. But I think it's time for us to have a discussion overall as a group and hear from our panelists the answers to your questions that, you know, probably are burning right now as you hear this new information. Some folks may be fully aware, like Ms. Loretta, who's worked in the system, on the call of how the court process works, how the criminal legal system, and some people may be hearing this information for the first time, right? In your experience of Colorado, in your role as the INC, and as you think about how this connects to all of the economic development, the work that you guys are doing with citizens in the rhinos, in the neighborhoods that you're in, who is in these communities? What are they experiencing in the criminal legal system? So I want to thank Emmett and Loretta for bringing such a pressing topic to the INC. But at this point, we're going to pivot to audience questions. I am perusing the chat real quick. And what I'm seeing is one of the things that they wanted the panel, the audience wants you guys as a panel to expound on, Mr. Landau and Ms. Cowan, is going back to, it looks like one of the questions is around the disparities when it comes to juveniles, right? What happens with the outcomes for juveniles in the court system, in the criminal legal system is the question. And can you talk a little bit more about that equity? We'll start with you, Ms. Cowan, then we'll punt to you, Mr. Landau, as you wrap up your question. I will, kind of raise my hand in time because I want to make sure we get to more questions, but we'll start with you, Ms. Cowan.
You know, unfortunately, I think the juvenile justice system is no different than the adult justice system. I think that people come in, be it principals, be it SROs, be it teachers, also come in with these implicit biases. And we have become a 911 call. 911, call them. Let's start these track records. And if they are Black or brown, they're less apt to be heard or listened to. We're not given an opportunity to explain. As much as I have seen with non-Black and brown children, everything to keep them out of the system is done on the front end. With our kids, it's very different. And again, I think it's this whole school to prison pipeline. And when young people come to see me who are Black and brown, we have those conversations about, hey, do you know that the color of your skin is a crime? And that doesn't make it right. It just means we have to be a lot more aware. And unfortunately, is the tide somewhat turning? In different places it is. I would posit that a lack of consistency through the judicial districts keeps the funnel continually going. And that is what is unfortunate. Now, in the counties that do have juvenile diversion, I can say those diversion counselors do everything to keep those kids out of the system, everything in their power. And I appreciate diversion, and I wish we had it in every judicial district for that reason, because it works. They get the services they need, but they're not getting a criminal record, and it helps.
Thank you, Ms. Cowan. And folks, I'm just going to stay off the camera to monitor time for the audience questions. And so just wanted to lay that caveat. Mr. Landau, the question is around outcomes for juveniles as it relates to equity. Could you expand a little bit more on your experience of interacting with folks who are young adults who are involved in the system and their outcomes as it relates to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, all of the protected classisms that our Constitution permits us? If you could talk a little bit more about that, that's one of the audience questions. Mr. Landau, please go ahead. You'll have 1 minute.
Yes, absolutely. My apologies. I had to turn my camera off for a second. So what I see in reference to young people in the criminal justice system, I think are a couple of things that we need to discuss that haven't necessarily been highlighted. One being that I agree with other panelists, Ms. Cowan, in reference to there isn't much difference. And actually, not long ago, did we have a criminal justice system that was sentencing juveniles to life without eligibility for parole. And we even had, we call them JLWs, juveniles without the eligibility for parole. And that in and of itself kind of, I think, shows the consciousness of the prosecuting body, the criminal justice system, that we are also quite content with locking juveniles up for the rest of their lives in very inhumane conditions. And as you highlighted earlier, this being the brain of an individual who isn't fully developed yet, what kind of development can actually take place in a growing mind in an institution like that? Another thing I think when we're talking about juveniles is the idea about calling police has gotten many young people killed. The idea about calling police has certainly led to the introduction and the revolving door process in the criminal justice system, simply because of people being too afraid or not having enough patience to deal with a young person in their time of crisis. I think one thing we need to definitely consider is am I really out of resources when dealing with this young person? Do I really need to contact law enforcement? Have they broken the law? Or are there other services this individual could utilize? Young people, we these are our future. And as a father now, I have a daughter who's about to turn 7. and calling the police is something that I can't wrap my mind around. In fact, I am afraid when she's playing with her friends in a park that somebody else may contact law enforcement and law enforcement may arise. So I think these are traumas that I have to deal with in the community based on inequities of the criminal justice system when referencing young people. So I think the best thing for me to do as a father is to try to educate my daughter again on how to avoid introductions to the criminal justice system. And as a community, as a father in the community, I think my role is to figure out how to put to the forefront alternatives to calling the police in schools, in the community, and wherever else those kinds of services may be required.
Really interesting point, Mr. Landau, for those of us who are parents, right? When we think about the criminal legal system and juvenile involvement and outcomes, right, for based upon inequity, right? The conversations that we have to have with our children as it relates to engagement in the criminal legal system, are those conversations different as a parent? What are the outcomes? The outcomes matter based upon the color of a young person's skin, which is really important. For those of you on the call who are not fully wrapped around the Colorado's juvenile system, Colorado definitely has a system that also incarcerates youth, to Mr. Landau's point, around juvenile life without parole. We have a system that is called the youth offender system, which is the basically prison for young people, right? Also with juvenile detention centers, right? And on average in Colorado, over a year, close to 6,000 young people engage in these systems a year, per year, in both the juvenile detention centers and also the juvenile prisons as well. Miss Loretta can speak to this. Her and I actually know each other, or crossed over. I used to work in juvenile. I worked in juvenile for 15 years and saw how this system works and the laws and legislation that have came down the pipeline to try to mitigate the increased number of young people going to our detention centers and our prison system. So Miss Loretta and I have both worked on that type of policy, but we can also lend a perspective of the disparities are real based upon the color of a young person's skin. And like to Mr. Landau's point, the initial engagement in law enforcement, like you've heard from Ms. Cowan, the school to prison pipeline of where it starts to get to the audience question. We're gonna move to the next audience question. Are we doing okay on time, Loretta?
Yeah, I mean, do you want to get the one question in the chat that came at about 10:14 that kind of dovetails on this? It's talking about DPS and
Yes.
civics class. Okay, perfect.
Yes, absolutely. Question to the panel from the audience. Are the panelists and Juston involved with DPS, the Denver Public Schools, as to civics classes and other ways to educate students around these issues? If not, any recommendations about doing so? New superintendents coming on board this summer. Perhaps a good time to ask this of the three candidates up for the position. So it sounds like the audience question. I'm gonna summarize it a little bit for the panelists. And that is school superintendent elections are coming up this summer. We've talked a lot about the school to prison pipeline. Is this an opportunity? Is there an opportunity to engage schools and educate them more on these particular issues? In addition, is there any push for civics? And I think Ms. Cowan hinted to this, civics classes being reintroduced back into early childhood education, where students start to learn the different roles of our local government and the different roles of the criminal legal system as it relates to civics. So in summary of the question to the panelists, are you guys seeing opportunities here with the elections coming up for the next superintendents? I'll start with Mr. Landau.
You know, thank you. As we roll back into these public spaces post height of the pandemic, some of the things I think that are important to keep in mind as we talk about engagement, as we talk about young people's engagement, and we talk about elections, one thing that can easily be utilized in these conversations is that you can still vote in Colorado with a justice-involved background. JC, I know you know the nuances behind those better than anybody. I also think that people need to understand that this is, for Denver Justice Project, I can't expect DPS to roll out a functional curriculum around civics without organizations like us at the table. We've been in schools across DPS, even in Jefferson County, Lakewood, other areas teaching Know Your Rights trainings. We have District Attorney 101 training, anti-oppression trainings, all of these things that, exactly to your point, shouldn't be up to the responsibility of people impacted and educated in these sectors in the community. But since it is, Denver Justice Project feels that this is the way that we force the reintroduction of civics into the lives of young people, is by doing trainings in schools. If schools won't let us do them, we'll do them in the park. We'll do them in your basement. We'll do them kind of wherever the need for the knowledge is at. So, I mean, I would love to see something like this transpire. We've partnered with entities before, but it's usually a real progressive individual, a professor, a teacher, a superintendent, a principal that invites us in. But I can't speak to anything that I've seen rolling out statewide that suggests this content is being distributed in a educational manner, in a correct manner, on a wide scale to our young people.
Really interesting response, Mr. Landau, because, you know, part of what you shared is that community having to engage our schools, especially DPS, on being able to partner in a way to provide training to not only faculty and staff, but the students, having to engage the schools, and the schools not engaging community or other professionals on this issue, on these issues, but more so about the issues and not an actual curriculum of civic engagement. And I think you threaded the needle really well, Mr. Landau, in saying, yes, it's offered not only in DPS, but other school districts. But again, there's no statewide mandate. There's no intentional ordinance or legislation or anything that says the schools across our state should be doing this. And it's interesting as we tie that to superintendent elections coming up this summer, especially for DPS. What is the expectation of a new superintendent? Are they considering the things that we are discussing to the audience question? Ms. Cowan, same question from the audience. Are the panelists or Juston involved in DPS as civics classes are being offered or not? And are there recommendations about how to go about so, considering that the elections are coming up this summer for the new superintendent? How do we have this conversation? So I'm gonna punt it to Ms. Cowan. Ms. Cowan, you will have 1 minute.
So my involvement is much like Mr. Landau's involvement. I get invited to, I've been to East, I've been to Metropolitan State University, Aurora Central. I get invited to come to a specific class, which is either a social justice class or a combination of criminology and social justice. And then I kind of give my mini civics lesson. I find it, you know, sad that the schools are not making civics such a big part of the curriculum. So then there's kind of nowhere to go. And so I would posit that for any superintendent that's up for the job, that needs to be a question that is asked. We can only do what we know to do. So there has to be an education piece so that these children know, A, what this country is really all about, but B, also what they are up against. I mentored for a very long time with Colorado Youth at Risk, and I would spend a lot of time with youths from everywhere and talking to them about what they needed to be doing, how they needed to be walking and dealing, kind of existing in this world that we're in. I think that there is a big lag, and there was a question I seen, I just want to speak to that really quickly about what can be done. What can be done? One of the things I had a neighbor say to me after the George Floyd incident was, I kind of turned my TV off for a long time, and now I can't ignore it. We all just can't ignore it anymore. And I think if we are all the loud voices, we're at Parents Council, all courts are public for criminal courts, ladies and gentlemen. Let these judges and DAs know that you're watching. And that's how our voices really, really get heard, so that these conversations are really being had. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Cowan. Very important. How do we engage, right? It can't be this anecdotal presentations in classrooms. How do we charge when we really think about the next superintendent? As, again, I always go back to tax-paying citizens. These are our dollars, you guys. Their values have to align with us as constituents in DPS. Are these conversations happening with any candidate running for superintendent? Right, so I'm so glad you got to hear from our panelists to that question about is civics being offered in schools, especially in DPS, why or why not? Are these issues being elevated to where young people, faculty, and staff understand the impact of the school to prison pipeline? It's really important as constituents who vote these people in to raise these issues. And to Ms. Cowan's point, criminal courts are open to the public. Not only superintendents being elected, but DAs are elected. Judges are appointed. Judges are up for retention. Defense counsel, to Mr. Landau's point way earlier, is charged with the integrity of defense according to our Constitution. Are they being watched? Right? Our public defense system is a state system that is funded by your taxpayer dollars. And they have the monumental responsibility to protect and serve as well in public safety. So these are great topics, great conversation. I'm gonna add one more question from the audience, then we're gonna do a closing statement to wrap up by the panelists. I am hoping that this information is rich. If there are folks who never knew anything about this, you have learned something today. If there are folks who actually have some understanding of the court system and the criminal legal system and the impact and have learned something new. And again, I'm really hoping that that happened today. So the last question to both panelists from the audience, and I think Ms. Cowan started to hint towards this. I'm gonna give both of you 1 minute to answer this question. Then we're gonna close with closing remarks from both of you. And the question from the audience is, what can neighborhood, this is very important, I'm so glad this question came about. What can neighborhood organizations or us as individuals specifically do to support throughout thoughtful change to the criminal legal system? Are there examples of change strategies that work to address access and equity from other communities, states, even countries? Are there examples? So this is the question to the panel from the audience. What can the neighborhood organizations do? What can individuals do? Are there examples out there that you can think of to really change the legal system that we are talking about? I will start with you, Ms. Cowan, and then we'll go to Mr. Landau. And for this, I will give you 1.5 minutes.
This is a big, big question.
Yes.
These are things that Mr. Cooper and I have talked about for years. I think one of the things that we can do as a community, we have to broaden that definition of community and to really see each other as the humans that we are, and that we're all wanting the same sorts of things. Our end goals are all the same. When I have these conversations, say with neighbors, or as Mr. Cooper mentioned, I'm now getting into real estate. So you can imagine I'm out meeting people now all the time. It's that we've had such this, I kind of stick with my group mentality. And then if you're on the outside of that group, and I'm not even just talking about ethnicity or race, it could be any group, then I don't really see you as the person that you are. We need to see ourselves as a community first and foremost. And until we do that, then it will always be us versus them. And I do a lot. I seen a question in the chat, if I could just speak to that. Yeah. I don't just speak to Aurora Central or DPS. I went to Overland High School. I did a lot of work at Cherry Creek High School as well, because I think that inclusiveness, that we are all in this together, is the mentality that we all have to have going forward. I did a lot with Broomfield High School, a lot with Legacy High School, because I'm in Adams County, so that there's not just one broad stroke of this underserved community, but also overserved communities, so that they can see we all have similar goals. We're not that different, and we're not that far apart. The voice has to be given that to everyone, these are all important to everyone. And if we can address it from that perspective, I think then the mentality starts to change.
Really interesting. You know, when we think about with the INC, diversity, equity, and inclusion, Ms. Cowan hit the nail on the head with inclusivity. Race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, those things don't matter when we think about community and who we are as a people. Bring into Mr. Landau's background of being a human rights activist, the human aspect of what we are all faced with. I would say all the time, for folks who have not had any encounter or understanding of the criminal legal system, it impacts you. And I give this example when people are really just shaken by this, right? As taxpayer citizens, we foot the bill for the very system that we're discussing today, you guys. And how that translates is if you have children, you yourself, or any folks who are pursuing higher education, post-secondary education, you've noticed in the last decade that tuition has increased significantly. Most folks would say, why? Economists would chalk it up to inflation, right? All the economic evaluations of why the cost of not only living, right, but school has went up. What folks fail to realize is over the last decade, our leadership in our state has elected to defund higher education and K through 12 as a priority, prioritizing prisons. That trade-off means that universities don't receive state funding anymore, which is why you're seeing a lot of universities privatize, which increases tuition. So your taxpayer dollars are being reappropriated to the very criminal legal system that we're talking about and not higher education. So regardless of experience or not with the criminal legal system, it impacts all of us, to Ms. Cowan's point. It is really important that we're inclusive as we think through strategies, examples, and things that have worked, whether they're local, state, national, or international. Mr. Landau, this very same question, what could the neighborhood associations or organizations, and individuals do in the change theory of this criminal legal system? And more important, are there examples that you have seen of how people get involved in, you both as panelists have hinted to this and addressed this in some of the other questions, but more importantly, you two as panelists, we chose very intentionally because both of you have backgrounds in real estate and community development and economic development in communities, not only just your advocacy and your work in reforming the criminal legal system, but you also have engaged with neighborhood organizations, associations, HOAs, especially you, Mr. Landau. I know some of the development projects that you've done. You have this hybrid, you both have this hybrid experience of what we're talking about with the issues of criminal legal system and really some of the role and responsibility that the INC plays in communities. So to the question of what can neighborhood organizations do and individuals do to be a part of this change theory, Mr. Landau, minute and a half, what are your thoughts to that question?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, based on my experience growing up in white suburbs, you know, I had the unfortunate realization very early on that most HOAs, most neighborhood associations excessively ridiculed and criticized my parents because of their children for a variety of things. And that also led to neighbors calling the police for a variety of unnecessary things. So I say all that to preface this. I think so for me, as a neighborhood organization, as an HOA, as a group of community members, exactly like Ms. Cowan said, installing opportunities for community to actually rebuild that community sense. That's not just like a barbecue in the park. It might be, but that could also be an intersected, that could be a clothing drive, that could be a canned food drive, getting your community involved with something that is going to fuel the community, something that's going to build an investment, a community investment in where you live. If you look at how your community looks and you're proud to be there, you're proud to see this magical relationship between you and your neighbors across the street, crime will go down. You know, people's self-image, self-esteem will go up. Some of the things that I do in my community, for example, I built a house in a predominantly white suburb that now I only allow Section 8 recipients to live in. I did a similar thing in Park Hill, and they're running a nonprofit daycare out of the house. So, I mean, these are things that I've taken into consideration as a homeowner, as a community member, as a Black man, knowing the disparities that I've had to overcome in my lifetime, that I can open up opportunities for other families, other community members, especially as we see schools starting to open up, childcare starting to open back up. These are all things we can do for one another. Grocery drives, breakfast drives. These are the kinds of things that I think we need to put forward as community, as we rebuild the sense of community, while subsequently dismantling the criminal justice system. If there's nothing but love in my community, there's less need for police. There is no need for a gang unit if gang violence is significantly on the decline. There's no need for detectives and investigations and narcotics agents if my community's healthy, if my community's looking out for one another. So I think to take care of ourselves and one another in times of crisis, to learn how to utilize our money in the most effective way to yield the most return and possibility for cash flow, we will also subsequently reduce the need for such a stronghold over the top criminal justice system and police presence in our communities.
Did we lose Justin? Hi. All right. I don't know. But I really appreciate our panelists, and I think this is just awesome. And we really appreciate your knowledge, your thoughtful presentations today. And I think there's some, I'm sure there's more questions, and I know we might, have an opportunity to have you back again. We will have a third panel discussion about the process of when people come back into community, right? That's something that we want to really talk about. I think this gave us a basis for really talking about, where people go, how they get into the system, how the system has some disparate impact on individuals who are in community, and how they are treated in the court system once they are part of the system. That comes from, again, thank you, Ms. Cowan, so much for your perspective on DA, and now as a defense attorney. I mean, that's a great perspective to have both, and I think that's really valuable to have both sides. And I love when people have both sides of the picture and you can really look at them and kind of analyze that. And again, Mr. Landau, thank you so much for your input. And we have Juston back. There we go.
In true fashion, my entire internet just dropped. You cannot make this stuff up, folks. Super sorry about that, Loretta. Thank you so much.
That's okay.
And I know we were wrapping up, and I missed the tail end of that, Mr. Landau's answer, but I know you were in just acknowledging the panelists. And so thank you so much. Folks, we're gonna wrap up this portion of the agenda. And I wanted to wrap it up with one last thing to our panelists, if that's okay. 1 minute. Do we still have time, Loretta?
Right,
Sorry
go ahead.
about that technical difficulty. But the last question and closing statements, both panelists will have 1 minute to answer this question. We will start with Ms. Cowan, considering Mr. Landau answered the last audience question last. And that question is this: if you could change one thing, Ms. Cowan, about our court system based upon the outcomes you would like to see for people who go through the system, what would it be and why?
I would change this focus on punishment if I could. I think that just focusing on punishment, as we grow as a country and as we grow as people, we have learned that there are so many other factors that cause people to either have contact or to live their lives in a certain way. And if we were more focused on, be it trauma, be it, there was a question in the chat about gentrification, which we didn't get to, but I wanted to end with it. That is an important conversation to have, because when you think about gentrification, what it's not taking into consideration is now we have rival gang members living on the same street in Aurora. And what have we seen with Aurora? It looks like baby Chicago. So we have to talk about, again, it gets back to this community thing. If we go to the foundation of community, we're less away from punishment. If we look at this as a community issue, our focus away from punishment, more geared at resources. Alex brought up a very good point about the hours of 3:30 to 5 before mom and dad get home. right? And that's the time that gang violence is up. Well, we don't have boys and girls clubs on every corner. We don't have rec centers for these kids to go to. But if we all think of it as a community issue and not, we just want to send them to prison, it's not our problem, we're done with it. I think that is the one thing I would change. We need to be more reform oriented, more treatment oriented, and we have to start looking at each other as brothers and sisters and not those people over there.
More reform oriented, more treatment oriented, all of us inclusive as a community. I hear you, Ms. Cowan. Less punishment. We have dealt with decades and decades of investment of now close to billions of dollars in a criminal legal system. Fundamentally, have we felt more safe? What can the role of the INC do as it relates to what we're hearing today? Thank you so much, Ms. Cowan, for that answer. Less punishment, more rehabilitation, more investment in communities, after school programs, boys and girls clubs. Where's our taxpayer dollars going? Mr. Landau, in your closing statement in a minute, the question is, if you could change one thing about our court system based upon the outcomes you would like to see for people who go through the system, what would it be and why?
Wow. Yeah, very loaded question. I think for me, what keeps coming back to the forefront of my mind is I don't feel safe, and nothing about public safety brings me anything less than anxiety. The whole concept about in other countries, I was in Africa. I was in East Africa when the father of a bride to be, was a prisoner of war in prison. The prison let us pick him up, take him to the wedding, and then drop him back off at prison the next day. And so like this level of separation in an impoverished, actually war-ridden part of the world at the time, still saw humanity far deeper than anything I've seen in the United States. So like, how do we re-include this level of humanity in this conversation of reform? I have to drive hours to go see friends of mine who are spending time in prison, and that's very intentional. Imagine if the majority of people who are serving in here come from marginalized communities, and it's a tank of gas there and a tank of gas back, time, all of these things. There's no real chance for you to go out of your way as a family unit to actually try to preserve some level of stability or kinship or camaraderie in this person's life. So, I mean, for me, there's absolutely nothing about this system that is beneficial for the stability of a home if a loved one is being separated from their family. For me, I think it really does come back down to, how do I feel safe in my community? How do I remove overwhelming, over-militarized police presence in my community? How do I remove those individuals from my daughter's school as a 6-year-old, when we know these individuals are comfortable killing people like Tamir Rice, like Alonzo Ashley, and all these other individuals you see behind me? So for me as a father, I think step one is, this system is never going to make people who look like me feel safe. My life matters, and to preserve my life, I need to think differently about the people who I surround myself with in my community. And before I call the police, I'm going to go over there and see if there's some sort of resource I can provide as a community member.
Old school, neighbor to neighbor, neighbors taking care of each other, bringing humanity back into how we think about public safety. What does it mean to have a system like in other countries where they center humanity over punishment and give opportunities for loved ones to connect with each other and still be held accountable, is what I'm hearing Mr. Landau say. Our
Right.
system of accountability, right, has far prioritized punishment over community, like Ms. Cowan was saying, right? These are the things that both our panelists would say. They had a magic wand and could wave and change the court system and our criminal legal system as it relates to our communities, are very important, essential things that they would implement and bring forth to the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a very deep discussion about our court processes. We've heard from 2 experts, lived experience and professional experience, share with you their perspective on key questions to tee up the conversation as we think about the INC's interaction and engagement with community. But more importantly, at the center of the conversation, thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to a criminal legal system that impacts the very neighbors that you are next door to. When you're making your decisions as a board and you're thinking about community vitality, community development, zoning, each rhino, the diversity, equity, inclusion of the constituents or the people or your neighbors who are in that community. What does the development look like? What are the decisions that bring vitality to the very communities you serve? The criminal legal system has an underlying effect on every decision that you guys make as a board. Each month when you come together and discuss the mechanics, the logistics, the ordinances, the regulations in the Denver metro area, the people involved, our panelists shared with you a perspective on our criminal legal system, especially the court system, and how that relates to how you think about each time you engage as a board. Public safety, our communities, are we reimagining what it means? Are we reimagining what community means? To Ms. Cowan's point. In my office, we call it the big C and the little c. The broader community, Denver Metro, and right drill down to the precinct and the neighborhood in which you live and serve is the conversation that we are having today. I want to take this opportunity and time to thank our panelists, Ms. Jaime Cowan, Mr. Alex Landau. We want to thank you and applaud you so much for spending your Saturday morning with us here at the INC. We sincerely appreciate your expertise, your passion, your commitment to these issues, your work, and honor your lived experience with the very discussion that we've had today. If you are comfortable as panelists, please feel free to provide your contact information in the chat for the INC members, or directly to Ms. Loretta or Mr. Emmett, and they can distribute that out. If you're interested, please email us meaning the INC, Ms. Loretta and Mr. Emmett. If you're interested in continuing the dialogue, being available as a resource, or just having the discussion, or just keeping engaged with the INC as community members, we offer that opportunity to you. And again, thank you. For the INC, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to facilitate today's section of the agenda, participate as a consultant with the INC, and thank you for the opportunity for all of you being willing and open to engage such a rich discussion, but yet complex and controversial, and can be perceived as sensitive for others in their experience and engagement as it relates to the criminal legal system. I thank you all for allowing us to take this time this morning to have this discussion. I am now going to punt it back to our president, Ms. Loretta, and thank you again to the panelists. Feel free to, at this point, if you want to disconnect, you can. I'll leave that up to Loretta to share with the panelists what the next steps are. But again, thank you all for such a rich discussion this morning. Ms. Loretta.
Go. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate this. And thank you, Juston. And thank you, Ms. Cowan. Thank you, Ms. Landau, Mr. Landau. So thank you so much for presenting today. It's been a wonderful, valuable discussion. I think it gives us food for thought on how to move forward, what we need to do. It gives people a perspective of how to work work with community, but so much more needs to be done clearly. And I think that we've just very much touched the surface, right? Because there's so much out there. There's so many issues that come up. I mean, there's been things in the chat that, people have been commenting on, and we know that there's a disparity, and we know that the criminal justice system clearly isn't working when we are one of the, courts love to convict, but, the cost to our city, the cost to the state of Colorado, the cost to the country of how much we spend on incarceration, and it's not really making a difference. We're not working on the issues that, the issues that bring people into the criminal justice system and those disparities. So we know it's not really working. So, we applaud those people who are working to do changes and working for changes in the system, and especially in the court system. And again, if you saw, I added in the chat about what Ms. Cowan had alluded to was the Arapahoe County case. I actually know the individual who that judge was talking to, so I know her. Yeah, so it's a really difficult situation, but to know that judges are not immune from being racist, and that's what happened in that situation. So if you don't know about that, the Colorado court system is in turmoil. So they are major turmoil, sexist allegations, criminal justice, issues that, are prevalent within the court system. So there are issues that are going on. I know from the inside, it's certainly not a perfect system, and I'm glad I'm not in it. So I have to say that. But I appreciate everybody participating today. I don't know if there's anything else. Anybody else have anything you want to comment on today, or you need to present about, upcoming events in your neighborhood or anything else coming up? I'm not hearing anything right now, and I'm not seeing any hands raised. So I appreciate everyone. Again, thank you everyone for participating. I think we will look at the next steps and we will move from that. Thank you so much.